Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I got to say, boy, that sounds good, Mr. Chairman.
That is as good as it sounds to me, Senator. Thank you.
Well, congratulations, and I'm looking forward to the next 2 years working together.
Thank you.
And to Senator Rubio, let me say congratulations to you as well. We're going to miss you on this committee. We're going to miss you in the Senate, but you're going to do an extraordinary job at Foggy Bottom. And I will say if they capture you and tie you up in the basement, we will send a team to pull you out. You know, as I look back over the last 4 years of the Biden-Harris administration, there are a lot of policies that have done a lot of damage. Domestic policies, economic policies, but I think all of those pale compared to the damage that has been done to national security and foreign policy over the last 4 years. Over the last 4 years, this administration has systematically undermined and abandoned our allies, and it has systematically shown weakness and appeasement to our enemies. And the consequence has been disastrous. We've gone from 4 years ago, peace and prosperity, to today a situation with wars across the globe and every enemy of America stronger than they were when this administration came into office. I am confident the incoming administration is going to change that direction. I am confident that President Trump in the White House and you as Secretary of State are going to shift us back to where we should be, which is standing by our friends and allies and standing up to our enemies. Do you agree with that assessment? Is that what you intend to do as Secretary of State?
Well, let me say first, the foreign policy of the United States will be set by the President, and my job is to advise on it and ultimately to execute. I think the President has been abundantly clear, and that is his policy is going to be driven about making America safer, stronger, and more prosperous. As I said in my opening statement, everything the State Department does, every policy, every program, every dollar it spends, every initiative it takes has to answer three questions. Does it make us safer? Does it make us stronger? Or does it make us more prosperous? And if it doesn't, if the answer is not yes to one of those three, you're going to have a hard time moving that forward because that's the priority that the President, and that's the priority that, by the way, voters gave this President when they elected him. You point to a number of things that I think are critically important, and let me, I'll phrase it a different way, but I think we're saying the same thing. We have lost deterrence in multiple theaters around the world. So as an example, and I use this as a small-scale example, but it's really an important one. I think the year was 2019, the Wagner Group tried to get cute and came after some of Americans operating in Syria. And fire from the sky rained down on them. And that group was pushed back pretty hard. That's deterrence. They threatened us and they knew what the response would be. I recall the consternation here and in other places when Soleimani met his demise. But I can tell you it impacted Iranian behavior for a substantial period of time. No matter how tough they talked, it impacted their behavior. I think it's important to reestablish deterrence. And to the extent that that's been lost for a variety of reasons, the lack of deterrence is an invitation to war. The lack of deterrence is an invitation to hostility. It prevents the very thing that we hope to achieve, which is peace and stability in the world. And I do think we've lost deterrence. And I think in some ways it contributed to what happened in Ukraine. An item I know is very close to you and you've worked very on and we talked earlier today about is energy dependence. I recall President Trump at both a NATO summit and at the United Nations, and I recall the United Nations one in particular, President Trump said Germany is entirely going to be left dependent on China, on Russia for its energy. And they laughed at him. There were diplomats in the hall that were snickering. That's exactly what happened. It is one of the reasons why Putin believed he could invade Europe is because Europe would not push back because they depended on him so much for energy. Now, Europe is to be congratulated. They have moved very swiftly, particularly the Germans, to diversify their energy resources. But one could argue that we may never have had that invasion had that dependence not existed, because maybe who would have thought the European response would have been more forceful than he anticipated. So I do think reestablishing deterrence and strength is important because it prevents war and it gives us leverage in diplomacy, where we hope to solve 99.9% of the global disagreements we hope to solve through diplomacy, not through armed conflict.
I think that's very well said, and I want to give several specific examples. Number one, you and I are the only two Cuban-American senators. You're about to leave me as a lonely sole member of the Cuban-American caucus. Thank you for that, Marco.
And you know, if there are three Cubans, they always call it a conspiracy. So
now I have no one to play dominoes with. But Look, issues of Cuba, both you and I share family stories of parents who fled oppression and came here seeking freedom. As you know, as you talked about earlier today, this week the administration delisted Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. I think it was an absolutely shameful and reckless decision. I think it was a political decision on the way out. I think it was designed to hamstring the incoming administration. I am unequivocal that I think the Cuban government are evil communist bastards. Given your new job, I suspect you might be slightly less forceful in saying so and slightly more diplomatic, but I know you're hard on the question. But let me ask you this. Do you believe Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism?
Without a question, and I'll tell you why. Number one, the FARC, which is, elements of the FARC and the ELN for that matter in Colombia. These are narco-terrorist organizations and have been. They started out as ideological organizations and now figured out they're Marxists, but they want to make money selling cocaine. So they've done that. They have had the full support of the Cuban regime throughout their entire existence. We know that Cuba has been friendly towards Hamas and Hezbollah, openly friendly towards Hamas and Hezbollah. We know as well that the Cuban regime, for example, hosts not one, but two countries' espionage stations within their national territory, 90 miles from the shores of the United States, and that provide valuable insights and cooperate with these elements. We know that they have strong ties to Iran as well, and the terrorist elements associated with them. And we know for a fact that there are fugitives of American justice, including cop killers and others who are actively hosted in Cuba and protected from the long arm of American justice by the Cuban regime. So there is zero doubt in my mind that they meet all the qualifications for being a state sponsor of terrorism.
Well, it is clear you're going to be confirmed to this position. You're going to be confirmed with an overwhelming bipartisan vote. I think it is likely you'll be confirmed on January 20th, on the first day the president is sworn in. When you are confirmed, I think it is also likely, I hope on that very first day, you will reverse that determination. You may not feel prepared to make that commitment now, but is there anything you want to say on that?
Well, I would just say, again, I don't want to speak ahead of the administrations. These decisions, as I said, the president sets our foreign policy, and my job is to execute it. That's how our system of government works. I would just remind anyone on this recent deal with Cuba that just happened over the last 12 hours, nothing that was agreed to is irreversible or binding on the new administration. And I think people know my feelings, and I think they know what the president's feelings have been about these issues when he was president previously. And nothing that the Biden administration has agreed to in the last 12 or 18 hours binds the next administration, which starts on Monday.
Good. Let's turn to Israel. In the last 4 years, this administration has been the most anti-Israel administration we have ever seen. They have systematically undermined the government of Israel, particularly at a time of war. The Biden State Department secretly asked other parts of the administration to suspend anti-terrorism sanctions so they could pour unaccountable hundreds of millions of dollars into the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. They refused to implement mandatory congressional sanctions against Hamas terrorists for using human shields. They made incredible efforts to secretly circumvent mandatory congressional prohibitions on money going to the Palestinian Authority because of the PA's support for pay to slay. Even after October 7th, they secretly poured millions and even cash from American taxpayers into Hamas-controlled areas. Meanwhile, they secretly implemented boycotts of Jews living in Judea and Samaria through the Development Finance Corporation and binational science and technology foundations. They secretly manufactured files used to impose crippling financial sanctions on Israeli Jews and refused to provide those files to members of Congress. Those sanctions were renewed just yesterday. I have every confidence that President Trump and you will reverse these policies broadly and specifically, but I'd like to ask you about some of them quickly. Can you commit to ending anti-terrorism sanctions waivers related to Palestinian terrorism and implementing sanctions against those terrorists?
Yes.
Can you commit to ending discriminatory policies, including Biden administration's secret boycott policies against Jews in Judea and Samaria?
Yes.
And can you commit to reversing the discriminatory sanctions against Jews living in Judea and Samaria?
Again, yes. I think that the policy of, again, without speaking out of turn, I'm confident in saying that President Trump's administration will continue to be perhaps the most pro-Israel administration in American history.
And the final question, you and I talked at great length about the 1944 water treaty with Mexico. Mexico is in violation of that treaty. It is doing enormous damage to South Texas. Farmers and ranchers there are experiencing drought. As the Secretary of State, tell me what the State Department can do to encourage and incentivize Mexico to comply with the treaty and provide the water that they are obligated to provide to the people of South Texas.
I think raise it in every engagement. We will be engaged with Mexican partners. We have to engage with the Mexican government, and it's important to elevate it and raise it at every one of those engagements. And I don't just mean like sending a letter or somebody sending an email or just mentioning it. I'm saying making it a priority, and it's a priority not just because it matters to Texas. It's a priority because these international agreements and arrangements only work if they're complied with. And if they're not complied with, and it becomes habitual, other nations believe they can begin to violate them as well. It undermines this entire commitment to multilateral agreements and so forth. And I think it's in the crevices of those agreements, whether they've been in place for a long time and no one's paying attention anymore, or it just doesn't matter enough and you ignore it because you don't want to destabilize the rest of your relationship, but it encourages it to happen more and more. It is not the only irritant we have in our bilateral relationship with them and in our agreements. I imagine they have some with us as well. But it's one that needs to be prioritized and raised consistently as a priority, not just as an asterisk or a footnote.
Thank you, and you're going to do great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.